I'm very excited to be here to talk to you about an issue that we've been looking for a solution for quite some time. Ever since we started working with responsive web designs, we've been looking for ways to handle images and handle them better than we were. So after 4 years, 4 or 5, maybe 6 versions of a specification, depending on how you count them, some heated, sometimes name-calling exchanges on mailing lists and on Twitter, we finally reached the point where responsive images are here. They've landed. They're available today in Chrome, Firefox, and Opera. Significant portions of the specification are implemented in the next version of Microsoft Edge. The rest of them are in development for Microsoft Edge, and they're also in development for WebKit. Although with WebKit, because it's an Apple browser, we don't quite know whether Safari will adopt responsive images, but it's a good chance that we will see responsive images across the board. What's interesting is that this is something that designers and developers have been asking for quite some time, but the response to it hasn't been overwhelmingly positive. It reminds me a little bit, actually, of my favorite cartoon character, Wile E. Coyote. I love Wile E. Coyote for many reasons. The Rube Goldberg style designs and schemes that he gets into to try to catch the Roadrunner. And the fact that he persists in trying to catch the Roadrunner so many times despite failing. The thing that most people don't know is that he actually caught the Roadrunner once. In 1980, in Supersonic, Wile E. Coyote finally caught the Roadrunner after 51 years of failed attempts. And so I want to show you this moment of TV history, so you can see that that Wile E. Coyote finally caught his Roadrunner. Finally happened. This is the way designers and developers have been responding to responsive images. It's something we've been asking for quite some time, and then we finally hear that it's coming, and we look around, and we look at the markup, and we see this monstrosity, this large Roadrunner, and we wonder, what have we done? This is not what we asked for. We see this in comments on blog posts, people talking about responsive images, and then they say, this is too complex and heavy. Can you imagine doing this for 300 images? Or there's so many things wrong with these new responsive image systems. There's so many things wrong, I cannot take the time to enumerate the many ways in which these are wrong. Even people who otherwise might be considered future-friendly have talked about how they've been confused by the standards and say, you know, Brad saying, long story short, I don't think anyone should use images on the web. That's the way Brad wants to solve this. I have to thank Jeffrey for this photograph. I was looking for embarrassing photographs of Brad to use for this quote, because that's what friends do. And I was on Flickr, and Flickr has this new interface where if you accidentally click, like it zooms in. And so then this happened, which was absolutely terrifying, and it validated something that I've always wondered about Brad, which is there's something a little messed up about him. As a matter of fact, I now believe he has some sort of voodoo going on, because after 2 years of trash talking, I was finally going to kick his butt in basketball, and then I tore my ACL like 2 weeks before. So I'm pretty sure he went to a voodoo shop and hooked and injured my leg in some way. So I can understand why people think that responsive images and that sort of complex syntax won't work. I mean, look at what happened with gradients. I mean, gradients were so complex that nobody wants to use gradients anymore. Well, actually, we do, right? Like, any time we introduce a new syntax or a new standard, it is complex the first times we start interacting with it. I think the reason why, when we look at the responsive images syntax, we sort of have a visceral reaction to it is because we've thought of images as being very simple. Right? We just add an image element, we reference a source, and then we've got the image in the page. But the reality is that images have always been difficult. They've never been simple. And for those of us who have been working on the web for quite some time, we remember the days when we had to worry about 216 web-safe colors, sort of making sure that we had color space, and we had to use specialized software like Debabbilizer to make sure that we had done this well. Linda Weinman went and wrote, in 1996, Designing Web Graphics. It was a bestseller in the days when tech books actually were bestsellers. And it was 258 pages of content about how to design web graphics. It wasn't sufficient, so the following year she wrote a follow-up book, a second edition of that same book that nearly doubled the number of pages in it. Linda of lynda.com went on to found a tremendous business and sell to LinkedIn for billions of dollars, and that is why I'm here talking about responsive images, because that seems to be the path. I'm waiting for it to pay off. Something that Laura talked about this morning is the fact that the way in which we actually have the file formats that we use now, even if we save images differently, if we've got sort of horizontal stripes versus vertical stripes, makes a difference in how well images compress. I mean, she went into much more detail about this than I do. But the point that I want to make about it is that even in the image formats that we currently use, there's more complexity than we think about on a daily basis. So today, I'm going to give you tools that you can use to make decisions about the images on your site. So you can understand when you need to use these different types of syntax, how to understand what the syntax does, and also talk a little bit about some of the places where we haven't really solved problems yet, and that are going to be things that you're going to encounter, and that hopefully collectively we can figure out how to solve them. In order to talk about responsive images, we have to talk about use cases. Now, the Responsive Images Community Group has defined a bunch of use cases. There are many of them, and they are very interesting. But for me and for us, we really only need to focus on 2 use cases. The first one is resolution switching. And when we talk about resolution switching, what we're talking about is images that are displayed at different sizes or are consumed at different sizes. So we have different image sources based on the size that it's used in the page, or maybe screen density, any number of reasons why we might need different image sources. The important part is that nothing is changing in the image. If we open these images in an image editing software and we resize them, that would be sufficient for resolution switching. So any use case where the images are exactly the same, regardless of how they're being used, they just may have different size sources, that's resolution switching. The other use case is called art direction. And the art direction use case manifests in a few different ways. In this first example, we have a photograph of President Obama speaking about the success of the auto bailout at a Detroit factory. If we're on a large enough screen, it makes a lot of sense to show the factory backdrop. It adds context to the story. It tells us a bit about what's going on. But if we simply shrink this image down, it becomes unrecognizable. It's hard to figure out who is speaking. We might be able to guess based on the fact that there's somebody at a podium and there looks like there's an official seal. But we can't make out that it's President Obama. We'd be much better off if we actually cropped the image closer so that we could actually make out his features. Now, this is just one example of art direction, making some changes in cropping based on this, based on the size of the image in the page. But it's not simply cropping. Brian and Stephanie Rieger worked on responsive design for Nokia browser. This came out actually the same time as the Boston Globe site, and I think of it as another seminal responsive design piece. And in it, they've got this photograph of a Nokia device showing off the browser. Now, on widescreens, they wanted to be able to show as much of the Chrome as possible, so they have it in horizontal layout, where you can actually make out the details of that browser. But as it got smaller, the Chrome becomes unreadable. So they change from horizontal to a portrait version of that image, and they crop it so that you can still make out the important detail, which is the browser. Right? The phone itself is less important than what's actually on the screen of the phone. The more common example that I see when it comes to art direction has to deal with images that have text embedded in them. And I know in an ideal world, we wouldn't have any images that have text inside them, but this is a practical reality in some cases. So if we look at CB2, on their widescreen version, on their desktop version of their site, they have a large image that contains 3 photographs inside of it. It's got 2 logos, and then it's got some text. But on a small screen, if they simply shrunk that down, the text would be unreadable. The logos would probably be unrecognizable. So instead, on small screens, they actually change to be an image that contains 2 photographs and just the logos. Free People is a site that I find really interesting because they actually update their images on a daily basis. So even if they wanted to disconnect the images from the HTML, their production process probably wouldn't allow them to do it. There's just too many images going through their system. So they have a very similar thing. They have incredible art direction, but in the traditional sense of art direction, they have a lot of typography embedded inside these images, very specific designs. And as those images get smaller, if they were shrunk, the text would be unreadable, so they create a different version of the image. And we know that it would become unreadable because if you actually go to the specific sale page, you will find that same image shrunk down. So they change it for the home page, but they don't change it for the sales page. And when you go to it on your phone, it's not readable. So those are the 2 use cases. 90% of the time, what you're going to be dealing with is resolution switching. You don't have to worry about those art direction use cases. So how do we handle resolution switching? Well, the first thing we need is an image element, the image element that we've had all along. The image element is required for every responsive images solution. The way I like to think about it is that all of these new features, all of these new rules, whether it's the picture element or source set, all of these are, in essence, rules that are being applied to a box. And once we figure out what we're going to put in that box, and that box is the image element, we get to stuff that new image inside the image element. You can see this in action if you use JavaScript and you actually instrument an image element and you're, say, applying the picture element to it. You can watch the current source of that image change as the different rules are applied to that image. The first thing you should ask yourself is, if we've got an image element, do we need anything else? If you're not doing a responsive design, if you've got a fixed width single density site like Target does, the image element is all you're going to need. But even if you're doing responsive design, sometimes for some images, all you need is an image element. So this is Rainbow Nursery, this wonderful, wonderful website from the UK. Just gorgeous responsive design and animation. And at the bottom of this responsive design, we have the sorts of social links and logins and things that we would normally see on many sites. When we look at those images, what we see is a very, very small difference between the smallest version of that image and the largest version of that image. And when that's the case, we only need one source. They also use SVG and PNGs. And so if you've got a SVG image and you know that you're working with browsers that support SVG and you've got sort of a reasonable level that if the SVG doesn't load, you're still going to be able to convey the meaning of whatever that icon is, you can actually get away also with an image element. A little later, we'll talk about how you can use SVG in sort of a progressive enhancement way. But in both of these instances, you could find that all you need is an image element. When we move on to high density displays, that's where things start getting a little bit more complicated. And this is where the first piece of this new specification, this new syntax comes in. Source set. So there are 2 different ways that we use source set. The first one has to do specifically with high density displays. And it allows us to have a comma-separated list inside this source set attribute. And for each one of the values inside that comma-separated list, we're going to actually have a pair of values inside of it. We're going to have the path to an image and then the display density of that image. So in this example, the first value that we have, cat.jpg, it doesn't have a 1x or 2x. And so if it doesn't, it's assumed to be 1x. And the second one is cat-2x, and it declares 2x. So now the browser will know if it's got a 2x display that it should use the 2x image. Easy, right? I was setting you up a little bit, because now it gets a little bit more complicated. Say we had an image like this image from Apple's Watch page, and we only had the 1x and 2x images. Well, the 1x image is 256K at its largest size, and the 2x image is 508K. This is far, far too large to be used on a mobile device. And if we're doing a responsive design, just defining things as 1x and 2x isn't going to cut it. We need to have more sources. And I think that it's difficult to start thinking about 1x and 2x when we don't know what size we're talking about when we say it's 1x or 2x. Are we talking about the largest size or the smallest size? So these display density descriptors sort of fall apart when we start looking at responsive designs. Thankfully, SourceSet also has what are called width descriptors. So width descriptors allow us to define a series of sources that the browser can then choose from. When you define this list, again, this comma-separated list, you're going to declare 160W, 320W, whatever it is. Those widths are the width of the image saved on your disk. And this is a point of confusion sometimes, because in other places we're talking about what the width should be displayed in the page. But really what we're talking about here is if we opened up this image in an image editor and asked what the native resolution of that image is, ignoring DPI, ignoring all of that stuff, that is what we would put into SourceSet, the true width of that image. And then once the browser has this list of options, it picks the image that fits best, which really begs the question, how does the browser pick the best image? And this is where things get a little challenging. This is actually the big question that took so long to figure out, whether it was browser makers or the responsive images community group trying to find solutions for responsive images. We spent more time trying to figure out how to solve this problem than we did anything else. And in order to understand why, you have to understand a little bit about the way the browser downloads assets. So if we take a look at a timeline, this is coming from an event parts timeline, we'll see activity that happens, right? Images being requested, files being requested, and things start the way that you would expect. The very first thing is the HTML document is requested. And then at a certain point, the HTML document has been fully downloaded, and the browser starts parsing the HTML document, and it requests CSS and JavaScript. Almost immediately after that, images are requested. And then time goes by. And this is all in milliseconds, so it's not like this is as slow as my scrolling is. But at some point further down in this timeline of activity, where more images are getting requested, more data is being downloaded, at some point CSS evaluation begins, all the way down there. The reason this is important is because images are getting downloaded before the browser knows anything about the layout of the page. If CSS hasn't been evaluated yet, the browser is going out to the web and grabbing all these things. This is what browser makers call either the look-ahead pre-parser or speculative downloading. They've got different terms for it. But the idea is that the browser, once it receives the HTML document, will actually go off and start two different processes. One of the processes is what we think about normally, the thing that's like going through the document and sort of building up the page and creating the DOM and figuring out how to do CSS and JavaScript and everything else. But this other process, all it does is go through the document and rip out URLs that it thinks it should download and starts downloading them, whether or not it actually needs to download them. So images are downloaded before the size of them in the page is known. The only thing, really, that the browser knows at that moment in time is what the size of the viewport is. So if we go back to this example, where we've got all these different sources, and we try to figure out how the browser is going to pick it, well, it works really well if the size of the image is nearly the same size as the viewport. Right? All of these images are about 100% of the viewport size. But on this Walmart grocery site, as the site actually gets larger, if you look at those images down towards the bottom, you'll see that now they're about 1/3 of the size of the page. And as the page gets wider still, at some point, they stop growing. We end up with a viewport that's 1,540 pixels wide and images that are 254 pixels. So there's very little, there's no relationship really between the size of the viewport and the size of the image in the page. But all the browser knows is the size of the viewport. So how do we provide the browser with information about the size of the image in the page so that it can succeed? Now this has actually been the thing that's been the biggest battle when we've been looking at responsive images. It's a tug of war between what would be ideal for responsive images and what the look-ahead preparser or that speculative downloading function would need to operate well. The way I like to think about it is it's akin to being on vacation with, say, one person who likes to have everything planned out, wants to know what exactly their itinerary is, where they're going to be, where all the train stops are, everything that they're going to see, versus somebody who's just going to roll into Austin and be like, hey, what's up? I'm here. Right? Like, this is the difference. And the look-ahead preparser is that person who wants everything known ahead of time. And responsive images would be much better off if we just waited until the very end, until layout was known, so we knew the size of the image and we could download just precisely the image we need. This look-ahead preparser and this behavior is the reason why we can't solve responsive images with CSS, JavaScript, or some magical new image format. Inevitably, when people start looking at the complexity of the new responsive images syntax, at some point they say, wow, why can't we just use JavaScript? This comes up over and over again. Well, now you see why. JavaScript's not even there when images start downloading. The same is true of CSS. The magical new image format may not be something that you've thought about, but there are a lot of people who are familiar with the fact that like JPEG 2000 allows you to just download portions of an image as opposed to the full image, and then just display that portion. And so you could just download just the bytes necessary for the size of the image that's being used in the page. And that would be really cool, because then we don't have to define 5 sources. We can just point to one source. But if you're paying close attention, you might have noticed the catch-22. And that's the fact that the browser has to know the size of the image in the page to know when to stop downloading. And it doesn't know the size of the image in the page. And that gets us back to the essential conundrum. At some point when we were working on this, I started to wonder, well, responsive design is the future. This is where we're all building things. Like, is this look-ahead preparser really that big a deal? Can we just ditch it? Like, make our lives easier? But the reality is that Chrome found that when they implemented this feature, that it was a 20% increase in page speed on average. Firefox found a 19% increase in page speed. Steve Souders talks about the fact that this improvement was the biggest boon to web performance of the last decade. Ilya from the Chrome team found that 43% of image fetches are initiated by that speculative HTML scanner, and that 50% of the average page weight is downloaded by that speculative downloader, which means 50% of our pages are downloaded at a point where the browser doesn't actually know the size of the layout. So we cannot ditch this. We can't throw it out. We have to figure out a way to work together with this behavior, because we want users to have a fast experience. And that's where the hero of our story comes in, which is the sizes attribute. The sizes attribute is the one that people don't know as much about, but actually is the most powerful one. And if there's any piece of the new responsive images specification that will last long term, I think it's probably going to be sizes. Because sizes is the thing that maps between the size of the image in the page and the viewport size. It's the thing that allows the browser to know. So anytime we're using width descriptors in SourceSet, we must use the sizes attribute. We must declare the relationship between the size of the image in the page and the viewport. The way this works is we again have a comma-separated list, and inside of it we have a pair of values. The first value is a media condition. Now this is not full media queries. You can't do print and screen and those sorts of things, but it does everything you'll want to do. Max width, min width, those sorts of items. The second thing is a length. In this particular example, these have been defined as viewport widths, which is something that Jen talked about yesterday. So in this case, we've got a width that's 100 viewport width, and then we've got 33, a third of the viewport width. This final value, if there's no media condition, it's assumed to be the default. So in this scenario, this would apply, this 254 pixel one would apply at any size above 900 pixels. And that length value can be absolute, relative, or even calc. So you could do things like automatically calculate margins relative to, say, viewport width and use it inside your sizes attribute. This particular syntax is actually the syntax that would work for this grocery site. So here we are at 100 VW, and then once we get past 480, it goes down to 33 VW, and then as the page gets bigger, it just becomes fixed at 254. I know that some of you are going to have the same concerns that I did the first time I saw this, which is, what about the separation of content and style, right? We work really, really hard. We've worked really hard over the years to break ourselves of the habit of including presentation information inside our markup. And when we are defining in sizes the size of an image at various viewport sizes, we are, in fact, telling the browser something about the layout, something about the presentation of that image at those small sizes or at those different viewport sizes. I want you to know that there's not a single person, whether they were a volunteer working with the Responsive Images group, an independent developer, designer, or somebody who worked for a browser maker, there wasn't a single person who didn't share this same concern. But the reality is that we needed a compromise. We needed some way to provide the browser with just enough information that it could make a decision about what images to download before it knew the size of the page, before it knew the layout. And sizes is that compromise, and it works really well. The great thing is that if you use source set and sizes, you're letting the browser be smart. You're letting the browser know enough information to be able to make smart decisions about what source to select. And it could select the 2x version based on the fact that the display density is 2x and based on knowing what the size of the image is in the page, and it could select the right one. But it could also select the 1x version if the user has opted in to and said something about their network connections being slow, or if the browser has detected something about network conditions being slow. If we had an image in the page that was 601 pixels wide, and there happened to be a source that was 600 pixels, the browser might select that 600 pixel width image and upscale it, just 1 pixel, instead of going all the way up and grabbing the next biggest image, which might be significantly larger. Like, the browser can make those smart decisions in a way that we're never going to be able to make them. And that's what's really powerful about source set and sizes, is that it gives that opportunity to browser makers to innovate and to create new ways of making pages faster. So we've been talking a lot about source set and sizes and haven't even touched on picture. And a couple of years ago, we were spending a lot of time trying to convince people that we needed picture and that we couldn't use source set, and we were sort of battling browser makers about this. So picture is still part of this. As a matter of fact, the entire specification is called the picture specification. It includes source set and sizes and types and all the things we're going to be talking about today. But I tend to refer to it now as the responsive images specification to avoid that confusion. Picture is really, really useful when we're talking about art direction. That is what it's designed for. Because instead of like source set and sizes where we're providing options to the browser and letting the browser choose, when we use picture, we're actually dictating to the browser what image it should use. So the picture element works very similar to the video element. We've got a picture element and then a series of sources inside of it. For each source, we've got attributes, optional attributes, the media attribute, a required attribute, the source set attribute. So the media attribute is a full media query. You can do everything that you normally would do. Source set is the full source set. So everything we just talked about, whether it's display density descriptors or width descriptors, are available to us. We have multiple sources, and the browser will take the first source that it matches. And if it doesn't match any of the sources, then because we've got an image in it, it will select the image. That's the fallback. Really, really easy. Shopify is using the picture element for art direction very much the way that we would expect. So they have a photograph on the site of one of their clients, one of their users, and on wide screens, on large enough screens, they show the image without any cropping. On small screens, they go in and actually crop the image, and they define 1x and 2x versions of this image, which works well because that image isn't flexible. It's actually just 3 set sizes. And then they define an image fallback. And their image fallback is actually the mobile version or the small screen version of this. Actually, the only sort of nitpick I have with their syntax is the fact that they refer to things as mobile, tablet, and desktop, whereas I would rather see them say small, medium, large, or something that wasn't device specific. But otherwise, this is exactly the way that we would want to use the picture element, using art direction, using it for art direction. There is actually another use case for the picture element, and this is the one that's really exciting. This is actually the thing that I'm probably most excited about with responsive images, and it wasn't what we set out to solve. But it is something that I think will open up new opportunities for us. So we can use the picture element to define different file types, different image types, and provide them to the browser as options. So, for example, we can have a source and have a type attribute on it which declares the MIME type of that particular source. And we can say, this is the SVG version of this. And if the browser understands SVG, they will use that. If not, they'll move down to the second source. And if they understand WebP, they'll select that. One thing to note is that in this scenario, we can use the picture element for resolution switching, not art direction. And so if we do that, we do not need to have a media attribute in here. As a matter of fact, we shouldn't have a media attribute because the media attribute is the thing that dictates to the browser what should be downloaded, as opposed to giving the browser options. And then if the browser doesn't understand WebP, then the PNG will be loaded. So now all of a sudden we have this opportunity to progressively enhance images and provide different image formats, so we can start experimenting with images in a way that we've never been able to before. The most exciting thing for me has actually been taking a new look at JPEG 2000. So JPEG 2000 happens to be really, really good at handling alpha transparencies, alpha channels. So in this example, we've got the same image. On the left, it's a JPEG 2000 image. It's 51K. And on the right, it's a PNG that's 237K. You can't tell the difference between them. But the JPEG 2000 image is much, much smaller. Here's another example of DICE. The PNG version of this image is 325K. WebP, better, significantly better, 56K. JPEG 2000, 19K. Now, I was unaware of this in the past. I didn't realize how good JPEG 2000 was in relation to this. But I tell you what, it wouldn't have mattered if I knew that in the past, because my response to that information would have been, OK, that's great, but I can't use JPEG 2000. Browsers don't support JPEG 2000. But come to find out, Safari does. Safari supports JPEG 2000 on both mobile and desktop. So we can use JPEG 2000 now. We don't have to have universal support for JPEG 2000 because we can use the picture element and we can define JPEG 2000 as an option. If we are doing this sort of work where we're doing a lot of alpha transparency work, it would behoove us actually to provide different options. Maybe to actually provide a JPEG 2000 version and a WebP version and a JPEG XR version for Microsoft. That's the Microsoft sort of version, and PNG is the fallback. And then people will have a faster experience. This opens a whole new world for us. Right? We haven't been experimenting with image formats since the beginning days of the web. Right? This is an area that's been so devoid of exploration that when you go and you look at the tools, the plugins, say for Photoshop, that allow you to do WebP or do JPEG 2000, the tools are really bad. I mean, they're good, they do what they're supposed to do, but they don't have the sort of emphasis and polish on them that the other tools do. And they don't, because why would anyone invest in that? Nobody was going to use those formats. But now we can experiment with them. We can find new ways. We can find out when JPEG 2000 makes sense, when WebP makes sense. And we can do it in a way that is progressively enhanced and works. And we don't have to worry about when all the browsers support these new image formats. And I'm really excited to see what comes of this. I actually don't know yet. I don't know when it will make sense to use these different image formats. But it's nice to be back at a point of exploration instead of an area where we have no options. So everything I've been talking about so far has been about inline HTML images, image element itself, not talking about CSS. So what do we do with CSS? Well, we need to ask very similar questions for CSS. Are we looking at art direction, or are we looking at resolution switching? And when it comes to resolution switching, there's actually a new property that we should use for resolution switching. It's called image set. And it may look very familiar to you, and that's because it actually was a precursor to source set. We had image set defined before we had source set defined. Unfortunately, because the image element had no good solutions for it, and in CSS we at least had media queries, there hadn't been a lot of emphasis on image set. So it doesn't support width descriptors right now. The plan is for image set to get feature parity with source set, but there's more work to be done before that happens. And one of the things that you'll notice, I forgot to mention that image set actually will work on any CSS that takes images. So border image as well will take image set. One of the things that you'll notice is that it doesn't have support across browsers to the same degree, despite the fact that it was actually the very first responsive images solution that was put out there. But this will improve. This is sort of the last piece of the puzzle to come into place. And when it does, we'll want to use it for anything that's resolution switching. In the meantime, when we're dealing with resolution switching for devices that don't support image set, or when we're doing art direction, we're just going to use media queries. The same thing we all know and love that we're using in our responsive designs. The only thing I'm going to point out about media queries is that if you're doing resolution, you can actually declare min resolution, max resolution. You can do this sort of stuff in CSS now. There's an old WebKit version that you might use for some of the older devices. But for the most part, you're going to use min resolution and max resolution. That's actually the new syntax. And then you declare dots per inch or dots per centimeter or dots per pixel unit. Now, the dppx thing really confused me for a while. And basically, what I found out is that 1 dppx is equal to 1x that we were looking at in source set. Why there's a difference has something to do with which browser maker proposed it and sort of the vagaries of standards making, which is a lot like they say about sausage making, that you don't want to see how it's made. All you need to know is that 1 dppx is equal to 1x, and then forget about the rest of it. All right. Once you've got all that syntax down, then you'll get to an actually more complex problem. Sort of a challenge that we're all going to face when we start implementing responsive images. And that has to do with image breakpoints. And what I mean by image breakpoints are how many image sources do we need to supply for a particular image? Now, this is really easy when we're dealing with art direction, because the art direction will probably tell us when the text becomes unreadable, and that's when we've decided to design a different version of the image. And so because of that, we know that's when we need to switch from one image to another image. But image breaks for resolution switching are a koan to me. I have trouble figuring out what the answer should be. For responsive designs, the way that we determine where our breakpoints are is that we simply resize the page until the page looks bad, and then boom, that's when we need a breakpoint. But if we try to do the same thing with images, we find that it's a little bit more difficult. If we have an image that goes from, say, 2,000 pixels wide at high density and 200 pixels at small screens, how many image breakpoints? Do we need a small, medium, large? Do we need 4 image breakpoints? Do we need 5 image breakpoints? Like, this is challenging to figure out. And it's particularly challenging because if we try to use that same methodology that we use for our layouts to determine where these breakpoints are, we won't find answers. Because if we simply take this image and we scale it down, it's going to look good at every size. There isn't a point where the image starts looking bad where we say, oh, this is where we need a new image source. We might try to make a decision based on the file size. And that would be better. So if we've got an image that's largest size is 2,000 pixels wide and 250K on disk, and the actual size of the image in the page is 400 by 602 pixels, if we provide an 800 pixel wide option that's only 73K, that's much better. We've done good work here, people. This is an improvement. And we could do 600. That'll be great too. Actually, that's even better because now it's 42K instead of 73K. Awesome. But what about if we did 500 or 450? And you can just keep going. And sooner or later, you realize that the only thing you can say about this image is that the actual size of the image in the page is the only thing that you know. Any other size that you pick is too big. But we can't have an infinite number of image sources. So how do we make this decision? Scott Gell from the Filament Group, when he was talking to the WhatWG list about responsive images, talked about how he picked entirely different breakpoints for images than he did for layouts. For layouts, he would pick things based on when things look bad, sort of the things that Ethan was showing last night with portions of the layout and making decisions about when the layout doesn't work. But for images, he would pick images based on sensible jumps in file size. So when does it seem like we need an additional file because the files are getting too big? Which made me wonder, like, what is a sensible jump in file size? Because images compress differently. Both of these images are exactly the same size, but the one on the left is 151K as a JPEG, and the one on the right is 13K as a PNG. I started wondering if we could create a performance budget, take the ideas that Jasenia was talking about in terms of performance budget, and actually apply them to responsive images. So in order to do this, we would ask ourselves, what is the cost of flexible images? What does it cost to add flexible images as a feature to our web page? So if we have a source image that's 500 by 333 pixels, and it's 58K on disk, but in the browser it actually is showing up at 300 by 20. If we take that 320 and save it out into Photoshop at 320, we would find 300 by 200. We would find that it's 24K. The cost of flexible images is the difference between the size that we download and the size it would be if it was perfectly sized on the page. So in this case, 34K. So what if we set a 20K budget for flexible images? Well, this image, with all this visual diversity, would have 8 image breakpoints. And this image would have 3. Same JPEG quality settings, everything else. This is a lot of the stuff that Laura was talking about this morning in terms of the way in which images compress. This image, 7 image breakpoints. This one, just 1, because it's only 13K and we've got a 20K budget. Now, I'm not recommending that you go and you do this for every one of your images. I just want to make the point that image breakpoints are not a science yet. We're still trying to figure out how to make these decisions. And performance budgets are just one of the ways in which we're talking about it. Some of the folks at Akamai and Google have been talking about, instead of using performance budgets to make these decisions, actually looking at what the most frequently requested image sizes are using their systems, and then having those cached on their CDN close, so that that actually provides a performance boom. But in order to do that, they need to hook up the size of the frequently requested image sizes up to some sort of analytics and change them over time as our devices change and as the popularity of devices change. So we've got a bunch of different ways that we could handle this. I think the big takeaway that I have is that humans shouldn't be doing this work, right? Like, save for the web must die. We can't be doing this anymore. We cannot be in the business of making decisions about how many image sources we need. We need solutions like what Etsy has, where their content editors just upload an image, and then it goes through and makes decisions about how many image sources are needed. Now, I don't know what algorithm Etsy is using. It could be a very simple algorithm. It might be complex. It might be looking at performance budget. Maybe they went through and did some of this. Their engineers went through and did some of this work ahead of time to look at some sample images and decide how many image sources they need. Whatever it is, the burden's not on people who are maintaining content to make these decisions. We need systematic approaches to it, and it need to be centralized. In the same way in which we don't deal with video the same way anymore. None of us are sitting down and encoding video in all of its different formats and all of its different sizes and bit rates in order to make sure that video looks well. And we will get to this point, but for a while now, we're going to have to deal with defining image sources. The systems aren't yet quite there. And even in the long run, we'll still need to define sizes. Because even in a scenario where, say, the system is going to define the number of sources, designers will need to tell the browser what the relationship is between the size of the image in the page and the viewport at different viewport sizes. So when you define templates, you'll still be looking at sizes. In the meantime, when you're looking at this and you're trying to figure out what sort of solution you need for images, I highly recommend doing a responsive images audit. This is very, very similar to content audits and other ways in which we audit our sites. You're going to go through a site and you're going to ask questions about the images that you have. Like, where are the source files and what is the process for publishing? Now, that seems a little bit counterintuitive because we've been talking a lot about sort of the technical pieces of solving these problems. But in my experience, the people piece is such a big part of what that process needs to be. You have to figure out where those images are. We had a client who had 300,000 images on their site that had been hand-cut specifically for the size of images in their page, and they wanted to move to a responsive design. So it suddenly became very, very important to know where the original source images were stored, how many of them were there, and how easy it was to relate them back to the original pages. Especially if you consider that if they decided they wanted 4 image breakpoints, that'd be 1.2 million images, and if they decided to do Retina, that would be 2.4 million images. They shouldn't be doing that by hand anymore. They probably shouldn't have been doing it at 300,000 images. Is there a big difference between the smallest and largest version of the image? As we talked about earlier, if there's not, you just may need an image element. Are we doing resolution switching or art direction? Can we use SVG? Are there representative images that we can use to find sensible jumps and file size? Which is much easier if you're a site where you've got sort of a specific photographic style, and much more difficult when you've got a site that's using user-generated content. And then do we want to support multiple image formats? Will we get a big boon from that? And if we do, how do we do that in a way that doesn't cause people to go completely insane trying to create JPEG 2000 versions and WebP versions? When we do these audits, we found some really interesting examples. One example is dealing with hero images. If you're not familiar with hero images, and I wasn't, a hero image is usually a large promo image on a page. For example, in this Target one, it's that box about Be Your Valentine. When I started looking into this, we were trying to figure out what the requirements were for those hero images so we could try to decide, like, is this resolution switching, art direction? How do we figure out how we're going to solve this problem and provide a process around it? And what we found is that the full requirements for a hero image are oftentimes that it's a box for marketing. And that's it. That's all you'll get. They may say this is how we're using that box right now, but they don't want to limit their future opportunities, and I can understand why that is. In an ideal world, we might replace the things that we used to do with Flash with HTML5 animations, like Apple does, right? We've got crazy scrolling and sort of all of these promo stuff. Maybe we'd do it in a way that didn't rely on scrolling quite so much and wasn't such a bandwidth. But we would build something like this. And this works great if you're the richest company on the planet and you only release products once a year, but that may not be where you work. Or we could do something like Crate and Barrel, where all the images are background and then they've got text over the image. And this works really well for a couple reasons. First off, they've got a fixed width site, and so they're not responsive. They don't have to worry about navigating the text over the image as the image changes sizes. The other thing is that they control all the photography, so they can tell the photographers to make sure that they've got space set aside for the text. But this may not work for you. At some point, we got pretty stuck on this, and we decided maybe we should just give the marketing people a box and teach them how to use the picture element and say, here's what you need to do, and all you have to do is figure out how many image sources you need. But that would basically be taking that entire image breakpoints koan and handing it off to people who are already overworked. That's just cruel. Don't do that to those people. They've got enough things to do. So we ended up looking at the text that was actually being used inside these hero images and creating an image that contained that text and then resizing that text so that we could see when the text became unreadable. And then we'd resize the page, which is not working for some reason. I think Keynote has decided to crash. We'd resize the page, and then as the text became unreadable, we would then decide that that was a point where we needed a breakpoint, where we needed to switch images. And then we'd create a new image with text embedded in it, and we do the same thing again. And this text readability dictated 3 image breakpoints. It just so happens that we ended up with small, medium, and large. And it sounds like we've got mobile, tablet, desktop, but that's not actually it. We found that if we would have been able to use 16-point, their specification said that they never used anything smaller than 18-point. But if we use 16-point in their typeface, we actually needed 4 image breakpoints. Now, this technique worked for one project. Your project will likely differ. But doing these sorts of surveys, doing an audit on your site of the responsive images makes a big difference. And it is a way to help you figure this out. On that site I was talking about with 300,000 images, we realized that there were only 6 main categories of images. 90% of the images were these property images that were resolution switching and that we would address with source set and sizes. And then we had some promo images that actually were art directed. And the rest were things that we could handle as one-offs, or sometimes they were images that were so small difference between the smallest size and the largest size. And they were also images that came from third parties. They were little badges that we would actually just use one image and use an image tag. In the long run, the big hope has got to be automation. As I said, humans shouldn't be doing this anymore. And there are some pieces of automation that are already starting. It's not fully there yet, but at some point it will get to the point where we don't have to worry about this. The first piece is using picture fill. So picture fill is a polyfill created by the Responsive Images community group. It allows you to use the picture element and source set and sizes and everything that's in the picture specification in browsers that do not understand that syntax, so that you can start using this now and know that you've got the support you need. Content management systems are starting to incorporate this new syntax into their system. So Drupal has a picture module that's actually going to be part of Drupal 8 core. And WordPress has a Responsive Images plugin that's maintained by the Responsive Images community group. And just last week, discussion started about which portions of this plugin are going to be incorporated into WordPress core. So across the board, we're starting to see content management systems start to try to figure out how to address images so that designers and developers don't have the burden of taking care of image sizing themselves. If your content management doesn't support this, there are a bunch of image resizing services. You can go, I've maintained a spreadsheet of these. You can go look at them. Another thing that we've found is that some of the clients we've worked with have been Akamai customers. And at certain levels of Akamai service, they have an option that does image resizing and does a bunch of this stuff. And you can leverage that. And our clients oftentimes didn't even know that they were at that level where that was an option. So you should look at your existing sort of CDN relationships to see if they're doing this sort of stuff. All right. So I know responsive images can seem daunting, especially when you first start. I understand that, and I understand why that is. And I also understand that you may feel like giving up sometimes. I kind of want to leave this photo of Brad up for a moment. If you feel like giving up, though, remember you're not alone. The Responsive Images community group is really amazing because it is the first standard that was really driven by designers and developers. Browser makers didn't think that this was a problem when we started. We had to convince them that it was a problem. Then we had to go define use cases. At some point, browser makers got on board, and they've been critical in helping us find solutions to it. But the Responsive Images community group is made up of people just like you, who are trying to figure out how to solve these problems, and they're very interested in seeing you adopt these new standards. We will be building tools to make this climb easier. You already see this happening with content management systems, incorporating image resizing into some of their core services. We will see more and more of that stuff. Both inside organizations and outside organizations will be able to leverage this. And we'll make that climb easier. But we have to take these first steps. We actually have to start using this new technology. And the time to start using the new responsive images stuff is right now. It's out It's in browsers. So the answer to the question of what to do now is to start using them. We're really anxious to see how you use them and to learn from you. Thank you very much. So we have like 5 minutes technically on the schedule. I also will totally understand if people want to dive and go get some lunch. But if people have questions, I can take maybe 1 or 2 questions real briefly before lunch. And if you walk to go get food, I will totally understand. Does anyone have questions? Oh, there's a question over there, sort of behind you, Toby.
Is the picture element a stylable container around the image, or is it replaced by the image?
So the picture element, is the picture element stylable? So this actually came up recently on Twitter, and I had never thought to try to style it. It is stylable. It is just like another div. I don't know why you would ever want to do that. Like, it's not intended for that function, right? So the image element, once the picture element has sort of been evaluated to figure out what rules apply based on the viewport size, the image element is actually where the image is. So if you wanted to make any changes to the image, right, like apply a filter or something of that nature, you would do it to the image itself. But the picture just acts like a div around it. So yeah, it is something that you could style, but I don't know why you would. Yeah. Stephanie up here. Oh wait, do we have? Okay. I have tremendous sympathy for Toby wandering around.
So is there a way to say don't download an image at this screen size?
To don't download an image at this screen size.
If I've decided that this image is sort of superfluous, illustrative, and not necessary for the mobile users, can I say, never mind?
So what I would argue is that if an image does not make sense at a particular screen size, that probably means that it's an image that is styling the page as opposed to an image that has content and meaning in the page. So that would mean that it would be a CSS image, and then you could use media queries, and if the media query didn't have an image associated with it, it wouldn't download. Yeah. Oh.
OK. I would argue that the hero image on the target site is unnecessary at the mobile sizes.
OK, so
I don't know if I could get marketing to agree with me.
Yeah. So in terms of a hero image, it depends, right? So if the image has, I mean, that's a judgment call about whether that has meaning for people or doesn't have meaning for people. Like, it has, if it does have meaning and it is something that provides information, like it's a hero image that might say that things are 50% off, right? That is actual content. In my mind, that belongs in the HTML. We might think that it's meaningless content. We might judge the quality of that content, but it is actually content. Versus, say, hero images that we see on some sites that are like video backgrounds or are like, like just big, beautiful photographs. And in those cases, we would use CSS and we would hide them. As far as sort of like explicitly declaring within the specification for an image element that we wouldn't do that, I can't think of one off the top of my head. And when we were having discussions about this, we talked specifically about the fact that whenever we were dealing with something that was an image in line, that we assumed that it would show up on every like sort of breakpoint, because that's like it related to the fact that we've got a single alt attribute for that image, because the image, regardless of what we do in art direction, should have the same meaning at all the different sizes. I suppose with picture element, you could probably figure out a way to do one that doesn't download at some size, but that wasn't what we intended. So.
Lunchtime.
Yes, lunchtime. Thank you all very much.